everybody, and welcome back to the test screening. My name is Chloe.
And my name is Billy.
We are back, and we're going to go straight in to what happened on this day in film and television history. Two very different films were released on this day in different years. So in 1936, Modern Times, written and directed by Charlie Chaplin, was released. Great film. Still funny. I've enjoyed it on more than one occasion. In 1944, Captain America, the serial film, was premiered, starring Dick Purcell, and that was the first appearance of a Marvel superhero outside of a comic. What do you say to that?
Well, in the case of the Captain America thing, I had no idea that the superheroes on screen were introduced visually that early, like all the way back in the mid-1940s. I thought that was something that came many decades later. I mean, not, Iron Man was the first sort of major Hollywood Marvel film of the new century, the new millennium, but I didn't realise they were going back as far as the 40s.
But it kind of makes sense for Captain America because he was a propaganda symbol. I think it's easy to forget that his origin story in the Chris Evans film was quite cleverly tied in with the origins of the comic series, because the first issue of Captain America has him punching Hitler in the face. He was like a propaganda he was like a proper propaganda figure and that is the right time period for that. So it's quite interesting how he has come out of propaganda into this cinematic universe. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, and how a lot of the modern day superheroes and now a more holistic and universal symbol for kind of solidarity and the best of humanity and sort of helping each other and companionship and camaraderie. Whereas, originally what one of the key ones started out with was just like kind of blindly trying to ensnare and influence, soldiers for conscription,
America,
getting them into America. Fuck yeah. Cue the Team America World Police thing. I actually watched that not that long ago for the first time in full ever and laughed pretty much all the way through.
It is. It's one of a kind. It is truly
outrageous.
Oh my god!
There's that Broadway number they sing about. It's a riff on Rent, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically they're just singing on stage about having AIDS, and I was just this is so terrible, but I cannot stop belly laughing.
Oh god! It's been a long time since I've seen it. It's like,
but still, like,
poor taste intensified.
Yeah, it really is one of those things that just sort of encapsulates the term poor taste. Mm-hmm. And actually, really funny because Trey Parker and Matt Stone's brand of comedy was so kind of smart in its satire and just take brutal takedowns of celebrity culture, but also so crude and gross out, like in the extreme. And then you have something like you say, like Modern Times, which to me is just one of the pinnacles of physical comedy. Not necessarily physical comedy in terms of slapstick, even though slapstick is there, but it just kind of in choreography. There's that. I mean, it looks so much more dangerous and daring than it actually is because of the way they've kind of positioned the background and the parts of the set to make it look like he's really high up, but actually he's not high up at all. The scene where he's doing the one-footed kind of rollerblading along that sort of upper tier of the library, and he's just kind of always just skirting the edge of the platform. And what they've done is they've positioned this sort of backdrop of books cleverly so that it looks like when you sort of superimpose it, that it looks like he's like way up, but actually it's like he's barely off the ground in reality, which is just super smart from a production design and staging standpoint, but also just incredible choreography on Charlie Chaplin's part to be able to just pull off that kind of feat of almost it's making comedy that's like a dance. And also just the bit where he's getting caught in the cogs of the machine. It's like he's kind of embedded in the set design. Just stuff like that just to me is some of like the smartest sequences of physical comedy like ever put on screen. And like, you know, if you haven't seen Modern Times, you know, it is one of the great comedies of all time, silent or talking.
Oh yeah, it's definitely worth a watch. I love silent comedies. I love trying to figure out how all the stunts were done. I like watching Buster Keaton and things like that. In my early film school days, I was obsessed. I was so obsessed that one of my early projects at uni was to do like a short film style, like silent film thing. I loved it. I love stuff like that. Trying to figure out all the camera trickery and things.
Yeah,
that is like
all the
good stuff.
All the tricks that were just like, you know, just purely based off ingenuity rather than any form of like CGI or green screen. And like, can you imagine trying to get a risk assessment approved for like a silent movie shoot?
Oh my god!
Like, there's that famous. You literally couldn't do it. You would have actors would be killed.
Mm-hmm.
There would be so many on-set accidents. It would be unreal. Like how the studios let them do it is actually kind of remarkable. But you know, different time. But there's that famous shot of Buster Keaton sort of sitting and just went, you know, I'm just going to stand here, and the front of the house sort of gets detached and falls on him, but the window kind of perfectly goes over him, and he just kind of had to eyeball it and go, so I think, you know, the window, the gap where I should be is going to be here, and had he misjudged it at all, he would have been killed.
It's mental, isn't it?
Actually insane.
Just completely flattened. My god.
But just like props to those artists, man. You know, they put modern they almost put modern stunt art. It's a shame.
I mean, talking about like Modern Times as a comedy, we were going to talk a little bit about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but I now think, since talking, that I've got a more interesting topic of debate in my mind. And that's kind of about how comedy tastes have changed over the years. We touched on it a little bit with Mean Girls. And the fact that the old Mean Girls has maybe a bit of a different sense of humour to the new Mean Girls, and that therefore the story doesn't quite work in the same way as it did in 2004. And just now with like talking about the A-Team and things, you know, that would never get made today. It just simply would not. You know, I mean, that there's still an appetite for that kind of comedy. You've got South Park and things like that, but what is it? You know, how has comedy evolved? Do we approve how comedy's evolved? Like, where is the line for these things? When does it stop being funny? I think it's a really difficult. I wrestle like with this myself quite often when I'm watching stuff that I find funny, especially if it's kind of like that edgy humor. I'm like, oh, I laughed. Why did I laugh? And I'm just wondering if you have any, like, do you think the same thing when you're watching, like, older comedies and things? Do you just forgive it because it's older? So, like, if you were to watch... If someone made the A-Team now, and it was exactly the same, and you went along to watch it in the cinema, would you think differently of it as to how you feel about it, watching it in your living room, knowing that it's from a while ago?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because... You know, I think about, you know, like old Mel Brooks comedies like Blazing Saddles that just like feature rampant like racial slurs and all that sort of thing that just make you go, oh my god, this would get eviscerated by social media and the court of public opinion today. But then again, you know, the lead actor who's getting all the abuse thrown at him in that film was black, and apparently he was, you know, in the writing of the film, he was very much, you know, pushing that and was very much in and constructing the jokes as well. So you kind of, I do think there's a bit of nowadays with people, you know, being as hyper aware as they are of what the rhetoric we're sort of using around sort of social issues and different minorities of people. You know, I think that's by and large a good thing that we're being that considerate of things. I do think it kind of leads to, you know, it can lead to some people who aren't maybe from that group sort of becoming offended on part of the people who are being satirized in a certain group, whereas those people might actually watch the film and go, that's a very funny take on our own cultural makeup. So it's difficult to know where the line of criticizing something and kind of just sort of stepping back and going, oh, you know, that's I might not quite understand the humour in the way it's intended in the same way that others do. It's so hard because like comedy is more than I think any other genre is a product of the cultural sort of zeitgeist that was sort of prevalent at the time. And some of those issues, you know, are still quite universal now and will always kind of be able to be returned to because of the sort of the universality of the theme. You know, you think about something like Jojo Rabbit from a few years ago, you know, that the idea of war will always be sort of a ever-present one that can be returned to and sort of filtered through different lenses. I know a lot of people sort of had varying different opinions on the way that film characterized the young boy's relationship with Hitler.
I loved that film.
I love that film too. I think part of the reason that works is because there is such that it is obviously taking a very, very dark and serious issue and filtering it through a very, very irreverent lens. But there is very, very heavy pathos and very sort of clear acknowledgement of the extent of the suffering and the issues that are tackled in it later on in the film with, you know, a certain character's, you know, death. But and how that affects others in the cast. But and again, things like, you know, there are some topics that are always just going to be touchy. And, you know, whether or not we're doing them now or decades ago is kind of, you know, is going to be, you know, by and by. You know, it's things like Life of Brian, you know, you could do Life of Brian now. You could do Life of Brian at any time and people would complain about Life of Brian. Yeah. I think it's also kind of thinking, you know, it's thinking about the tone of the comedy as well. You know, I look at some stuff in South Park and I go, that is gut-bustingly funny because that is just a really no holds barred, takes no prisoners takedown of a very, very shallow and not very likable public figure who's just like spewing a lot of like bullshit online. And they deserve to be kind of taken down. But sometimes the way in which they do it with certain people they do it by like inventing these. I think there's this one joke that sort of comes to mind in one episode that I just saw in a cursory fashion on TV one time, where I think it's Steven Spielberg and it might be Robert Zemeckis or another famous director, and it involves it's sort of, they do a riff on a scene from The Accused, you know, the Jodie Foster film about the woman that gets sexually assaulted, and I just think that I know, and I'm all for people, you know, taking down, you know, others, you know, in comedy, you know, that's what satire is all about, and we should be able to poke fun and laugh at each other. But sometimes the scenario with which they invent to do that, sometimes, you know, incorporates some actions and some behaviour that I don't really think should be joked about in such a flippant sense, because they do kind of cause, you know, outward suffering for a lot of people in a very real sense in reality. So I think it's, you know, it's a combination of social context, what the issue is, I think the tone of it and what you're trying to achieve with the joke. You know, is it just purely just mean-spirited jabbing and mockery, or is it a sort of an examination of what we're trying to unpick or unpack a sector of society or a behaviour that we all have that maybe deserves some reflection in the interest of changing that for the better?
I kind of feel a similar way. I think sometimes it depends on the day, Matt. Like, sometimes I'll watch something and I'm like, oh, that really doesn't work. And that, I tell you what, I've actually been watching, as an example, I'm a big Tina Fey fan, right? I think she's fantastic. I love Mean Girls. And I've been going back and rewatching 30 Rock, which is a great show. There are some jokes in there that have aged like milk. But a lot of kind of, and this is something that has happened quite a bit in her comedy, where there are quite a few race jokes that don't necessarily land. But I also know that Donald Glover was a writer on 30 Rock. But it's not, you know, just because he was a writer on 30 Rock doesn't mean that all of the race jokes were written by him. if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Those weren't exclusively.
That doesn't excuse, but it's an interesting one because in many ways it doesn't work and it's cringy, but in some ways it creates a very unique environment or a very unique feel to the comedy that is just so bizarre. I can't describe it. Have you seen it? Have you watched 30 Rock?
I've never actually watched 30 Rock. It's a comedy that has evaded me over the years, but I think it's also important to kind of go, just because a couple jokes are not every joke it's a very rare comedy where every joke lands perfectly, absolutely all the way through. So I think it's important just to not completely write off an entire film series
I'm
just
not
because of a few. I know
I'm
that,
still
but I know people who
enjoying it. I'm still very much enjoying it. I think I just find it interesting that these jokes are getting it into the show quite frequently, and some of them hit and some of them don't. And I'm just wondering, did who wrote the joke contribute to whether or not it hits and misses? Or is that a bit deductive to even imply that, who wrote the joke makes that much of a difference?
It is an interesting one. How much does artist intent reframe the context, kind of reframe the impact of a joke, or should we just purely take it at face value on paper, on screen, and go, yeah, that just doesn't work?
I do find myself getting fatigued by edgy comedy though. It was massive in the early 2000s, and some of it is funny, but I'm small doses. I have to do it in small doses. When there was I don't know if you ever watched any Big Mouth on Netflix. I got really into it in uni when it came out. It felt like it was like the new edgy cartoon. Is it for adults? Is it for kids? It's definitely not for kids, but it looked like it could be. And a lot of it was very funny. And I think the first couple of seasons, I thought it was hilarious. It's one of the funniest comedies to come onto Netflix. But then as time goes on and they just kept pushing, I don't know, I got fatigued by it. I couldn't watch more than one episode a sitting. I know some people could binge that kind of stuff, but I really can't. I think it starts grating on me after a little while. Same with Family Guy and South Park. I'm one episode's enough. I can't watch a lot of it.
Yeah, I used to I think because I used to binge Family Guy so much back in the day, but I think just now, because I just think it's a shell of its former self in its later seasons, it just needs to end. And also because, social media and stand-up comedy and all that stuff is so saturated with really close to the bone controversial humour. And I love a close to the bone joke as much as the next person. Frankie Boyle, Jimmy Carr, Kevin Bridges, all that sort of stuff. I love that kind of stand-up. But at the same time, if you don't have light and shade or kind of variation in your sort of style of joke, it does just kind of become tiresome. You think about a show like Sex Education, which thrives partially on crude humour. With that, me and my mum and dad still refer to that opening scene of season 2 as being one of, if not the single funniest scene in any TV show we've ever watched. In the car, oh my god, I've just never laughed like that, I think, at anything ever. But as we've talked about, before, you and me, on previous sort of podcasting ventures we've done, that show has an amazingly open and warm and empathetic view of sex and relationships, and a really well-developed cast. It really thrives on its more emotive drama sections as well. So again, you have that light and shade that kind of balances out the crudeness of the humour in certain scenes.
There's also things, we're going to wrap this up soon, but I just thought in my head, The Office as well, the British Office, whereas the jokes are close to the bone. It is cringy, it's hard to watch, but that lends a kind of realism to it. that kind of helps the show in that way, because to me, the joke of The Office, one of the reasons why I like the British one as much as I do, is that kind of, it's so painful because it feels so real. And these scenarios feel accurate, especially to the time period, the sexism, the racism, the thinking that the boss who thinks he's a jokester and things like that. There's just so many little truths in it that it kind of, I haven't really watched much of the American one, but that makes it a different show completely to take that away. And I think part of the reason why it works so much for me is the fact that it feels like a real office.
Yeah, exactly. But my mum always said that she thought she's generally not a fan of Ricky Gervais as a stand-up, but she says she just thinks his written on screen comedy series, fictional comedy series, are so well observed about how we actually behave. She said The Office she thought was genius because it's, if you've ever worked in an office, it's just like that. If you're from like a certain era, because, with some of the things you're saying there, I've worked in an office the past couple of years in my production management TV role, and I would kind of hope that I wouldn't see all the truths in the office in my time working in an office, but she said, working in an office, sort of early to mid late 90s, there's a lot of accuracy in it.
Yeah, definitely. So I think you need that humour sometimes. I think it's necessary when you're kind of establishing a time and a place, when things weren't the same as they are now.
And getting to the heart of why that behaviour wasn't okay then and why we can kind of laugh at it now.
Okay, we're going to move on now to our first review, and that is American Fiction. This is one of the Oscar-nominated films this year. It was touted as one of Barack Obama's top films of... Was it one of his top films of the year? Or was it one of his top books? It was based on a book, wasn't it?
Yes, he did list American Fiction as one of his favourite films of the year.
Nice. Which is high praise indeed, to be honest. I'm kind of like, if you've got 5 stars from Barack Obama on your poster, I'm like, maybe this is worth watching.
Yeah. Barack Obama approval plus 5 Academy Award nominations. It's a heavyweight.
It's definitely got the accolades behind it, but does it deserve them? So, Billy, this is one of the few Oscar picks that you haven't been able to see until now. What did you make of it? Do you think it deserves to be up there on the Oscars list? And tell us all about it.
Yeah, so based on a 2001 novel by Percival Everett called Erasure, and nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Leading Actor, Best Supporting Actor, and Best Original Score. American Fiction is a satirical comedy revolving around a writer, played by Jeffrey Wright, called a joke that I found instantly very, very funny. Thelonious Monk Ellison. His surname is Ellison, but they all call him Monk, as in Thelonious Monk, the famous African-American musician, which, I just got a kick out of that irreverent tone of the humour already. He plays a very intelligent and very academically minded African-American upper-class writer and professor situated in Los Angeles. His novels receive a lot of academic praise, but they sell poorly. He's not what one would call a commercially successful writer, or one that reaches a very wide mainstream audience. And his latest manuscript has just been rejected by his publisher for not being quote unquote black enough. There's a lot of very sort of sanitized white sort of demographic in the American population who wants sort of fiction, at least in this world, that's built out of a lot of African American stereotypes. Monk attends a book reading for a fellow black author who reads this book called "We Lived in the Ghetto," which just is which is a hilarious title, which is absolutely just riddled with the most egregious black stereotypes you can possibly think of, and yet the entire room, mostly full of white people, stands up and applauds when she reads the most bastardized, reading out of this book. And he is kind of disenchanted and disenfranchised with the state of the literary industry and the sort of the commodification of Black African American stereotypes in his day and age. And as a joke, he does his own sort of riff on this. He writes a book called My Pathology, the F instead of the TH, and just kind of go, oh, I bet the publisher's going to eat this up. And, to his kind of expectation is, meeting his expectations that they do that. But then they go, it's going to be the next big thing. We want to totally, push this and make this going to be a bestseller and everything. And it becomes wildly successful. And he's kind of sort of caught in this whirlwind of, trying to make an observational joke about the state of the way African-American stories are used in literature, but then actually sees a lot of career success that he hasn't seen up until this point doing so. So a very kind of smart and very irreverent premise that I can get on board with very easily. And I think what sets us apart structurally from other recent satirical comedies I've seen is that we're not immediately hit with that central conceit, kind of the birth of the plot centerpiece, or snide kind of Jason Reitman style voiceover world building, in the vein of something like Thank You for Smoking or Up in the Air. In those films, we're kind of hit with the central character's sort of mean sort of viewpoint of the world, and also all the sort of weird goings on of the industries they satirize right from the word go. But American fiction, it kind of takes a considerable amount of time to build out the complexities of both positive and negatives of Monk's personal life and his family life. He's fraught with very loving relationships, kind of unexpected tragedies, the very easygoing rapport he has with his sister, which is really entertaining to watch unfold on screen. And by taking the time to kind of build out those circumstances, there's very solid character and plot justification for the act that incites much of the farcical developments that happen later on and kind of house the main commentary of the story. And it means that comedy and exaggeration feels earned. I've talked with people in the past about sort of satire being at its best and working when it's just about credible, and this very much is. And I think Jeffrey Wright's also very well cast. He has kind of a dryness in his comedic delivery and a great perplexed face, but he's also got kind of enough Tommy Lee Jones tinged curmudgeonliness to his personality that kind of makes him sort of amusing to watch in that sense. But he's also got an everyman quality to kind of make Monk an enjoyably rough around the edges kind of personality. And I really appreciate the way he's written as a protagonist, in satirical comedies that poke fun at one person's place in a broken system. Oftentimes, the central character is to look at Up in the Air and Thank You for Smoking. Aaron Eckhart and George Clooney's characters, they're just unrepentant, morally bankrupt scoundrels, who callously hurt others as a result of what they're doing within that system. And then they kind of slowly learn from their mistakes, and usually by way of a more affectionate character that softens their heart. And I like both those films very much. That's not an outward criticism of them. But I love the fact that here is a really irreverent and intelligent, but also flawed protagonist who's kind of rightfully jaded with the industry he finds himself caught in, who then kind of, in an attempt to make fun of it and prove a point, actually creates a personal dilemma for himself and actually ends up kind of proving his point, but kind of throwing himself into a difficult situation. But he isn't kind of brainwashed by the ordeal either. The power doesn't go straight to his head and he becomes this kind of maniacal, cartoon-esque villain. And he finds himself caught between the personal gain and the lunacy that he finds and clearly recognizes in this scenario. It's really terrific and layered writing from a wider story perspective. It doesn't kind of become too lost in kind of literary trappings either, or kind of comedic jabs at the pretension of the literary world. It spends a good chunk of the runtime exploring relationships with his family. And I know that has meant for certain people it's been a little bit uneven story-wise. But what I thought that did for the comedy was it meant that it kind of subtly, not in a heavy-handed way at all, created this sort of mirror between the more nuanced and realistic relationships between Black characters and kind of the reductive stereotypes that the successful books in the film peddles. And it's kind of very, very quietly and, trusting the audience enough to work it out by just sort of presenting it on screen without sort of necessarily, big glowing neon arrows pointing towards it, going, these are actually the kind of stories that these books should be writing about. And it keeps the events of the plot and mockery grounded and not super preachy. And I think it helps balance out. I think it also helps balance out the fact that the points made about diversity in the writing aren't the most expansive. I think it is kind of very. Some of the humor is very sharp, and I do think the screenplay is very solid overall. But I wouldn't say it's the most insightful satire I've ever seen. It's kind of, very sort of kind of cool and nifty sort of in the moment, but I can't say it's stuck with me to the degree that certain other satires, both comedic and more dramatic, have done for me in the past. But it isn't, all that big of a deal when, the comedy is as thoroughly enjoyable as it is. I love how, irreverent the tone of the humour is, everything kind of down to the wryly nimble and plucky jazz score, and, the polished dialogue and the more hackneyed stereotypes, or the lampooning of white people's assumptions and misinterpretations of black people's behaviour. That's all, if not the most novel, it is quite well observed. And though it is all thoroughly entertaining, I do think at times I almost kind of wanted, the ludicrous nature of the book situation to just go a little bit further and heighten the delivery of the themes just a little bit more. Even going a little more abstract with the presentation of the comedy. There's a great Rye Lane-esque moment where Monk sees the scene he's writing from a novel play out in front of him. And I do wish the script and direction took more creative swings like that, rather than kind of keeping it as grounded as it does. But there's also a subplot involving Monk's brother's sexuality that I don't think entirely gels with the main satirical thread of the narrative, even if I can see what they were going for, and Sterling K. Brown does deliver a very good performance. So I do have my gripes, and if I compare it to the really big, amazing heavyweights that are all over the Best Picture category, it does stand out as being a little bit of an oddity. I don't think it's quite up to the quality standard of all the rest of the nominees, but I did still think this was very good, and I do like the fact very much that a African-American stereotype-centric satire is getting as much awards love as it is. I would give this an A-. It's very good.
Nice, and we'll have to wait until the Oscars to find out how well it's going to do. I've got a feeling in my bones that this is going to do very well at the Oscars.
I think it's got an outside chance that it could just swoop in on a couple of things like adapted screenplay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. From American Fiction to American Nightmare. Badoom. Yeah, documentary time, yes?
Yes, documentary time. A true crime documentary time, which isn't a genre I typically go for. I'm generally not a fan of true crime, as you know, or at least I'm not a fan of the current wave of true crime that just seems to be flooding the airways and streaming services at the moment and kind of dominating the viewing charts over the past several years. I do feel is like a genre that was once about sort of creating awareness of miscarriages of justice and holding people accountable has been commodified in pretty ugly fashion, kind of into this bingeable viewing model that kind of pushes thrill-seeking conversation over what the genre was initially intended for. And as a rule, I tend to not endorse or engage with true crime for that reason. I did, however, hear from some reliable sources that this series, 3-part documentary series on Netflix, was worth engaging in, and I'm glad I did. It centers around 2015 kidnapping case where a woman called Denise Huskins was kidnapped from her then boyfriend's home. Her boyfriend and her were held up by 3 masked assailants, and she was sort of snatched from the home. And he then immediately reported it to the police, and the police were immediately suspicious of him. But then, random emails started to come through, and the media circus and media frenzy started, and everyone started thinking the worst. And then the unexpected happened. And that's all, and I will say about the plot, because I feel like this does sort of, the structure of the thriller sort of structure of it does sort of thrive on you not knowing a tremendous amount about the true story. That being said, what I will say is that past its what seems like its logical, happy conclusion, there is distrust and grudges and prejudices exhibited by people in power and people in justice departments who should not have had them, and ultimately ended up damaging and peddling a lot of sort of vicious viewpoints and distrust of victims and women, in the interest of chasing a story or what they thought was a lead that actually had no real evidential founding. There are a few things for me that I feel puts us above the standard sort of true crime fare. For starters, the tone has this very uneasy and kind of conniving sense of tension through the score and sort of very pointed, sort of sharp delivery of the interviews that contributes to this sense that things are not as they seem. And it opts for an atmosphere of kind of brooding, impending disaster rather than kind of sensationalism and kind of all these. I mean, it does have a certain degree of polish in the pacing that I think you get. What I kind of refer to as kind of the Netflix sheen in the documentary context. But I do think that the intercutting here, it doesn't nearly have the sense of sort of overblown impact that a lot of them do. There's a sense of sort of atmosphere that, and sort of sinister atmosphere that I don't think always is prevalent in these kinds of films and series. And this tone then works very nicely with the show's abilities to kind of wrong foot and play with your expectations, which keeps you engaged. And it's then enhanced by the very sort of taut pacing and structure of the series. We have a very tight 3-act structure that is sort of housed within these 3 lean but quite detailed in terms of narrative, 45-minute episodes. And the kind of the more propulsive pace of the series than its contemporaries in the edit, with kind of the deft intercutting of reconstructions, interviews, and interrogation footage, means the presentation of the stories feels comprehensive, but also kind of neatly packaged and running at just the right length. 3 parts, it does not at all overstay its welcome. And the episodes also end with these well-timed cliffhangers that kind of propel directly into the main focus of the next episode, which keeps things very much moving, which I really appreciated. It doesn't get bogged down in unnecessary details like certain other documentaries do. And I think a majority of the story is related directly through interviews with those involved rather than narrative voiceover or kind of expository archive. It feels as though the voice has very much been given back to the victims and the survivors of this case, which feels empowering for them, and like the making of the documentary itself has been empathetic, and the filmmakers have had a lot of care towards that. This is particularly true of Denise Huskins, whose kind of main interview takes up the bulk of almost the entirety actually of the second episode. And many of the interviews, they feel very emotionally raw and feature very impassioned speaking from those involved, which again makes the series feel more urgent in its messaging and more empathetic than what this genre typically offers. And thanks to it not being overly stylized, outside of some slightly ill-fitting Dutch angles and some orchestral string spikes kind of on a rare occasion in the score, the framing of these people doesn't feel exploitative. I was pleasantly surprised. I thought this was a very solid piece of true crime that kind of got back to the heart of what I think this genre is about, sort of putting a lens on very negative practices in sort of police and legal departments, and sort of trying to ensure that we do better in the future. This was very good. It's a nice, brief, but very engaging watch, and I would recommend.
I feel exactly the same about true crime in general. There are very few that I kind of engage with. I did go through a bit of a phase of watching a lot of true crime, and it does something to you watching too much of it, where you kind of get desensitized to what you're seeing, and you see it more as entertainment rather than a real thing that happened. The true crime kind of gets taken out of it. And there's only a couple of documentaries and things that I've seen that I really thought did a good job with kind of changing that changing that narrative. So I will give this I will give this a go, because I am interested in good examples of this genre. One that I would recommend. Have you seen Wild Wild Country?
No, I've heard that that's a good one.
It is excellent. That's on Netflix. That's like a more of a cult documentary, and it definitely has some of the trappings, the true crime trappings of stuff. But in the general sense, it felt more like I was learning about a world that I didn't understand beforehand. I got more of that documentary feel about it, where in not the true crime, look at what this serial killer did, kind of thing, which is really interesting. The other one, which is really good, is Don't Fuck with Cats.
I like that one.
Yes, that one was great. And that one I felt had something different to it with the whole internet angle.
Yeah, because it's kind of like, it sort of has that sort of not non-biased, kind of interesting, sort of even-handed sort of look at the positives and negatives of sort of internet vigilantism, but also kind of tributes and sort of puts a very sort of supportive lens on these people who did manage to, in the end, sort of track down a killer.
Yeah, so I will give this one a go. It's a tricky genre to get right, I think, but you're completely correct. There is so much of it around at the moment that it can be easy to get lost. You can't see the wood for the trees.
Definitely, which is why I think it's good to highlight one that sticks out from the rest and feels like its heart is in the right place.
Moving on from documentaries to sci-fi, and this is The Creator. It's on Disney Plus. This came out, and there was relatively little fanfare to it. I remember seeing a few posters about it and being like, "Ooh, it's a new sci-fi. It looks very." I think that the one thing that put me off going to see it was it looked very Star Wars, and I was unsure at the time whether or not it was just somebody else doing Star Wars and what the actual plot was. But now it's on streaming. I can give it a fair shot. So, is my fair shot worth spending on The Creator? What's it about? And is it a copy of Star Wars?
So I'd heard similar things about it being Star Wars-esque before going in, and I see a little bit of where people are coming from on that, but honestly, I don't really think it's entirely founded, to be honest. What this brought for me, if anybody, was Neil Blomkamp, director of District 9, Elysium. It kind of feels like a grander, more epic in scope take on that kind of very grounded, scrungy, sort of dystopian-esque, it's kind of almost social realist take on sci-fi. And even though you can see it's kind of indebted to some previous films, I do think it's kind of a minor miracle when an original science fiction IP breaks through and it's actually also good. It's set in the future where AI has, that being a very present issue now, is sort of almost kind of not taken over, but it's people. There are AI machines now that are using technology to sort of mimic the faces of other people. There's this and sort of take on a much more human characteristic. They're seen as more of a presence than humans, sort of like sentient presence in society that has every bit kind of equal weightings as humans. And John David Washington plays a government agent who loses his wife, who is an android, during a undercover operation. He himself has lost limbs due to injury, but has had them replaced through these AI technology. And years later, he finds himself part of this sort of prejudice-fueled war against AI. Kind of almost a lot of it actually takes place in Asian countries, and I don't think the sort of the fact that it makes your mind almost kind of spring sort of towards Vietnam is entirely an accident. I think that is intentional. And he is tasked with setting out and extracting this and destroying this very sort of life-threatening, world-dominating weapon, or sort of weapon of mass destruction. And upon conducting this mission, they find out that the weapon is in fact a child, or an AI child, sort of an android child. And then through having to sort of escape that scenario and getting to know this kid and sort of getting set on path maybe towards finding his wife, who may in fact be alive, sort of starts to have a change of heart about the work he is carrying out. So sort of a lot of interesting ideas at play. The cinematography is stunning. I was immediately struck by kind of the deep blue of the nighttime and sequences, and the low light sequences, and how much the water and moon pops, as does a lot of the saturated color palette. It received an Oscar nomination for its visual effects, and I was very impressed by them. The design of the ships, the robots and weapons are very sleek and detailed. So much so that the overall presentation of the world and dystopian cities feels very believable and seamless, and I really bought into this sort of future scenario. The location choices are also stellar, actually. They're utilizing a lot of places in Asian countries like Thailand and Japan to contribute to the dystopian kind of otherworldly appearance. A lot of these sort of like almost tropical landscapes that they're using in some of these countries. And I was able to buy into the setting very easily as a result. And, like I said, some of the, these very gritty, steampunk, grimy sections of dilapidated cityscapes, and, it's a compellingly sordid view of the future and this potential war that could happen between humans and AI. It very much reminded me of Neil Blomkamp, this grit-filled technological aesthetic. Sort of evoked him in a very good way. There was almost this kind of one shot that, to my eyes, it seemed to very deliberately reference the Johannesburg occupied slum setting of District 9. And I'm a big fan of his, and I'm kind of very glad to see that sort of school of sci-fi filmmaking evoked again. I also like the fact that these very kind of smoothly emotive montages of family gatherings, the brutality of the soldiers' conduct in battling the AI, and the design of the androids that kind of very uniformly weave together artificial and human body parts. Through all this, the film does a pretty good job of kind of visually distilling the thematic undercurrents of prejudice, imperialism, and how that clouds who the real enemy is in this conflict. Like, there's not a lot of like big speechifying monologues or anything. To that end, the creator doesn't feel particularly disjointed in its combination of socio-political messaging and straight up chase-centered, action. But I do think, past a certain point in the narrative, whilst it isn't super polemical or heavy-handed in its messaging, which I do appreciate, I do feel at times it kind of goes too far the other way. And I think, especially towards the back end of the film, it does kind of just become a straight action film, and a very sort of intense, explosive, well-made action film. But I think it kind of, past a certain point, loses almost sight of the heady questions, kind of the screenplay sort of raised earlier on. And I do think it ends up kind of feeling like the creator isn't all that expansive in its exploration of its themes in the end. And the kind of the road movie transporting precious cargo from the form of a person that then creates a bond for a hardened protagonist, it isn't all that novel, but structurally the time frame is kind of more condensed, and the conflict kind of more pressure cooker. The fact that the conflict is kind of more pressure cooker in its makeup than the border crossing scope of something like The Last of Us does do well for the story. And the action is kind of brisk and crunchy enough to sustain action entertainment, without the shocking brutality of something like District 9. It is very sort of well made and punchy action. And I kind of thought to myself that for that reason it wasn't, blowing my mind. I also thought that I came to the conclusion that it wasn't blowing my mind because whilst he's solid as ever in the lead role, I'm starting to notice that I haven't taken all that warmly to John David Washington. And I think it's because he's not a very emotionally expressive actor. I don't think he's got conviction in spades, and how seriously he always sort of throws himself into a role and kind of naturally fits into that. But any real depth of emotion for me isn't all that evident from him. And I do think the dynamic between him and the child does slightly suffer as a result. So I do think it ends up not kind of reaching the lofty ambitions of its themes, but I did enjoy it quite a bit. And I thought it raised some interesting ideas. It had some sort of very sort of gripping action sequences, and it was very kind of visually grand in a way that I think I haven't seen from a big budget sci-fi outside of a massive franchise in a while. An interesting thing to note about watching it on Disney Plus is that it's shot in 276:1, which is ultra widescreen, more befitting of an IMAX cinema rather than 239:1, which is sort of standard sort of big letterbox widescreen. So in this case, watching The Creator, it's letterboxed more than your average widescreen film, meaning so it's quite long and thin. And I did think that constricted the action slightly. Tops of heads were starting to be cut off, but it did also, in a sense, contribute to the grandeur of the cinematography. So another kind of minor visual gripe, but again, I kind of got used to it after a while. This was solid. This was good. Not mind blowing. Not going to set the world on fire, but I'm happy it exists for the sci-fi genre. The Creator gets a B from me.
And it's been a while since we've had a decent sci-fi, to be honest, that isn't one of the big franchise films. So I'm quite happy that this film got the funding and got the backing behind it to be made. I do think, we have had hardened man takes child from A to B that may or may not destroy. I feel like if only it was Pedro rather than John David Washington, then he would have had
get behind Pedro
three of those in a row. And I usually I'm kind of a sucker for those stories because I like seeing it's a good way to have character development, and I enjoy the humour of having a gruff, hardened action guy having to interact with a kid. There's just something in that hits my soft spot of humour and storytelling, but we have had quite a lot of it recently.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I will give this a go. I like John David Washington. I actually, controversially, although I didn't like Tenet, I enjoyed him in Tenet, and I was kind of sad when that film. I was sad for him when that film wasn't as good as I thought it was going to be, just because I felt like his career trajectory got a bit stilted by that, because he did a great performance in BlacKkKlansman. I thought he was good in Tenet, and then he's kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. So I'm glad that he's getting back into these roles with a big budget sci-fi, no less. And I think there's definitely room for him in the the leading man lineup at the moment. I think he brings something a little bit different, but I agree that sometimes that emotional range isn't quite there. But I'd be really interested to see him in something like a drama or even a comedy. I'd be quite interested to see him do a comedy. I think in a weird straight man way, he'd be very good.
Well, there were sort of comedic chops on display during some of the more irreverent moments in BlacKkKlansman, so I think he can totally do it, and I would very much like to see him sort of out of that comfort zone and in there.
Definitely. Talking of comedy, so we've got our Valentine's episode next week where we're going to talk about rom-coms, but we've got one rom-com to end off our episode today. This has been everywhere, and I've seen the trailer so many times when I've been to the cinema, and honestly, it looks dreadful. So I need you to tell me.
I thought it did. I thought it looked dreadful as well.
The trailer made it look so bad. It looked like Mills and Boon levels of bad. But yeah, please tell me what this is all about.
I even made a joke last week about, you can't tell me I don't do my job because I'm gonna put myself through anyone but you. And so Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell very sort of have a one night stand, but through a very sort of cheap, verbal misunderstanding, they end up sort of hating each other and never speaking to each other again. They find that he is friends with her sister, and by virtue of that, end up getting invited to the same wedding. and a wedding which conveniently both of their exes show up to. And so naturally, the only logical course of behaviour is to pretend they're together, to try and take, because they don't want to have their exes, slavering all over them. So, and just sort of puppy dog eyes going, get back together with me. So they kind of go, oh, I can't be doing with that. Let's just pretend we're a thing, even though we hate each other, just to try and get through this in one piece. So I'm not, that doesn't exactly inspire glowing expectations, that premise. And there are certain things about it that I think are cheap. And I was fully expecting to go in and absolutely friggin' hate this. But whilst, again, I'm not going to give it the most glowing accolades in the world, I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised by how inoffensive I found it while it was on. And I anticipated the script being a lot more cringeworthy than this actually was. And the dialogue does actually have a somewhat sparky, cutting tone to it, with the various petty jabs that the central pair throw at each other. And this isn't at all in the same sort of league of explosive quotability or vibrant hilarity of Bottoms, Booksmart, Rye Lane, Big Sick, a lot of recent comedies, romantic and not romantic, that we've had. It was clear to me while watching this that a certain level of attention and care had been given to infusing the conversations with some wit and some intelligence. And it does, so there is that, and some lines started off like, oh, that's a little bit witty. I'm kind of getting on board with that. But it does make it a bit disappointing when the kind of script sort of punches below the belt and defaults to cheap kind of name calling. Like, there's a thing about her, there's a running gag about her repeatedly calling him a fuckboy, and I'm just like, that's just like kind of lowest common denominator humour, guys, come on. And, the film has shown that it's actually better than this. And I also could have gone my entire life without hearing the exquisite display of human poetry that is easy breezy Martin Scorsese. I really did just want to howl at that given moment. I think it gave me a hernia.
Oh my god.
I know, that's just, I thought you'd like that one. But there's also a number of semi-elaborate kind of multi-stage slapstick gags that, again, bit more screenplay forethought than your average studio rom-com, and aren't, exaggerated to the point where they feel completely ridiculous and cringeworthy. And it makes for a decent balance between the verbal cracks and physical comedy. And so Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell carry them off decently well. The score is surprisingly nice. I don't normally find rom-com scores all that notable, but there's some groovy drum machines and some summery bright guitar chords that were quite charming. The soundtrack features a solid selection of very befitting commercial songs, the most notable of which, and I couldn't at all get through this review without mentioning this because it has been all over TikTok. I mean, I really cannot escape it through Sydney Sweeney's Instagram or TikTok, whereas there's a very sort of central plot point that revolves around one of the characters connecting with the song Unwritten by Natasha Bedingfield.
Oh my god.
And you know what, if nothing else, watching Anyone But You, it was a great reminder to me of how wonderful that song is. It's been on my Spotify on repeat.
That is a deep cut. That's now that's what I call music 11.
Oh, it really is. It's proper mid 2000s pop charts all over, and it's been it's been responsible for putting that song in my Spotify on repeat, and it's used quite tastefully in the film. It's got actual plot justification and has a really fun credit montage of them all kind of blooper-esque singing of it at various different points in the film, which I enjoyed. I'm like, yeah, we can bring this back. This is cool. Sadly, it does have its flaws. I do take issue with the dynamic and interplay between the central pair. It kneecaps a lot of the potential of the other elements of the film displayed for me. Some people have cited them as having zero chemistry. I don't actually think that's true. I think there's moments of affectionate kind of breezy connection between the two of them, but more often than not, though, the verbal sparring is just really awkwardly delivered. I don't think Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell ever really settle into the seemingly punchy intended rhythm of the script. It does more often feel than not a bit stilted, and the punchlines sometimes kind of crash land. And a lot of the delivery of the dialogue is either too stilted or chaotic in terms of performance to feel feel natural or create the kind of seamless rapport you get with the best on-screen rom-com pairings. I mean, you think how just sort of effortlessly the two leads bounce off each other with the one-liners in Rye Lane. I mean, it just isn't even a contest. And in Anyone But You, this kind of unfortunately permeates a lot of character interaction, this stiltedness, and sort of dampens the entertainment factor for me. The coincidences and misunderstandings that major plot points are founded on, again, also feel pretty cheap and like they could be resolved with just even an ounce of actual adult communication, which again is kind of frustrating. Though I do think the tension of whether or not the pair will end up together is decently sustained, which I do think is a key factor of making an effective rom-com. So again, I was actually maybe impressed is a little strong, but I was surprised at the fact that this was almost decent. And I was sort of fine with this being on. I kind of got to the end and I was like, I don't regret watching that entirely. So a C+. Like we're going to go straight down the middle. It's fine. If you want a rom-com, go ahead. You could do far worse than this.
Interesting. I could have put money last week on that you were going to hate this.
Going on a rant.
Yeah.
3 rants in a 3 weeks, 3 rants in a row.
But yeah, I mean, this really isn't my genre either. Like there are things that happen in this genre that irk me so much. So I'm not sure if I probably wouldn't get a lot out of this one, to be honest. But I appreciate when a film in a certain genre does something right, and it kind of is good for that genre. I can appreciate that. So Anyone But You, will it be your Valentine's Day top watch?
Well, is that a question for me?
Yes.
Oh, definitely not. Like, I'll watch Rye Lane for the 4th time. Thank you very much.
Well, talking of that, so coming up next week, me and Billy are going to go head to head in a fight to the death over what rom-com is the best for Valentine's Day. This is the official list. We're going to decide what gets a bronze, silver and gold medal in the rom-com world. And we've got some good picks, I think between us,
we do.
This is going to be a hard battle, but I'm telling you now, Billy, you're going to lose. So, just putting...
I could say the same for you.
Putting it out there for a starter. I mean, I have Rye Lane on my list. You didn't get there quick enough, so...
I know. You snapped up 2 that I very much could have picked, but I'm also happy with my 3. So.
Okay, well, you're going down. I'm yelling timber. You better move. You better run.
I'm so scared.
Pitbull makes everyone scared. Right, and that's it for this week. But please tune in next week for our Valentine's Day special. It's going to be a good one. I'm ready. I'm ready to take you down.
I'm ready to take you down.
And on that note, thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe on YouTube. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And we will be back next week. Bye.
Bye.